Okay, guys, sorry for the technical difficulties. We will be resuming now. So first, before we start workshop 3, I'm just going to make small clarifications on here. Some of you people will seem to be having confusion on certain Git commands, which is totally okay. So the two commands we've been using a lot in workshops are git reset -hard and git checkout workshop, like wx step y. And just a quick review on what these actually mean. So git reset
Oh my. Sorry, guys.
The local version of your code on your computer to the version that's currently stored in the cloud. In this case, the cloud is GitHub. So, and it irreversibly deletes all the local track changes you made on your computer. So you may notice like, oh, if you're like inputting your name or something on Catbook, and then you git reset hard, like everything changes and resets back to its original state. So next slide. Basically, you're just taking code from GitHub, like GitHub is passing code to you. And then after a while, you're like using it for a really long time and you actually mess things up and you're like really not sure what you want to do now. So you might be thinking, wow, I wish I could just restore the code to the original working version, but I have to press like undo like 1,000 times and VS Code won't let me do that. So the magic here is using git reset -hard. It will just restore the code back to your original version that you got from the cloud. So like we use these in workshops because like we have like the versions set out in each branch, but like when you're actually working on your project, you're not going to be using git reset hard often unless like you mess something up like really, really badly. So most of the time, if everything is working, like you shouldn't be using git reset hard because it'll delete all your local changes. And for git checkout workshop X step Y, it retrieves the branch workshop X step Y from the cloud, again, GitHub in this case. And it's like similar to going through the version history of like Google Docs and selecting a specific version to restore. So it's like the same idea except in GitHub terms. So we want to check out a particular version of the code. And in this case, we store them as branches on GitHub. And so hopefully this clarifies things a bit. If you have more questions, feel free to post on Piazza, post in the questions doc, come to office hours. And quick small disclaimer before we start workshop 3. This workshop is like a pretty challenging workshop. It's also pretty long. Like we'll continue the second half tomorrow. So if you don't understand everything, like that's totally okay. Feel free to come to office hours, put yourself on the help queue. And like a lot of things like React is pretty hard to get the first time around. Like I didn't get the first time around, like a lot of people I know didn't get the first time around, but like, this is why we have so many workshops and like so many like help things going around. And by the time you start building your website, like you'll be forced to like figure it out on your own. And like, I feel like that's when like a lot of the learning and a lot of the understanding comes from. So it's okay if you don't get it right away. Okay, we'll start. I'll pass it on to Helen. Okay.
Let's get started with workshop 3. So for this workshop, we're going to be doing more React, and we're going to be applying what we learned today. More specifically, we're going to hook up our Catbook with APIs from the front end, and we'll also be doing some routing because most of your guys' websites will probably have more than one page. So this is just a way for us to get to those different pages. Okay, so in our last workshop, you guys learned how to make a static profile page in React, and you guys made components and had practice using states and props. And from lecture today, you guys learned about APIs, HTTP requests, and we briefly touched on asynchronous programming. Don't worry if it's still very unclear right now. We'll have a lecture in the future that goes more in depth. All right, so for this workshop, we're going back to Catbook. We're going to be getting more familiar with React. Hopefully, you guys will be a little bit more comfortable with React after this, but it's okay if you don't. And we're going to be interacting with an API from the front end. So we're not going to be building the API in this workshop. This API endpoint is just provided to you guys by the staff for you guys to use and play with for this workshop. But you guys will have a chance to make your own APIs in the next workshop. So definitely stay tuned for that. And just a refresher, a GET request is when you retrieve data from the endpoint And potentially you give the API like some parameters to specify what kind of data you want to get from it. And a post request, on the other hand, is when you send information to the API endpoint, and then that lets the server at the endpoint kind of make changes to the back end. So some examples of changes can be like updating a database or like deleting something from a database, etc. And we'll also get into databases in a future lecture. Okay, so this is the general like flow of a GET request, especially that we'll be using for this workshop. So once we make a GET request to the API, it will return some data back to us. And then we're going to do something with the API. So this is particularly useful for this workshop because this is the exact format of the data that we'll be handling today. And we'll be turning this data, this raw data, into components and rendering it like so. So let's get started. So if everyone can go to Capbook React repo, reset hard to reset all your local changes, and check out Workshop 3 Starter. And also hit that npm install. And if you guys have any questions or any general questions at any point, feel free to put them down in the questions doc. And if you need any personal or individual help, feel free to put yourself in the queue or raise your hand and our staff will get to you. But for the first part of this workshop, it's more of like a follow along, and then you guys can apply the same kind of principles in the second half, which we'll probably do tomorrow. Okay, so I will give you guys a few minutes to pull that up. I'll also pull up Capbook. And then, oh, I'll go back. So now to get checkout starter. And then I'll open VS Code. Okay. Now also do. Okay. All right. So moving on. If you guys look into the folder structure of this workshop, it's basically the same structure as last time. You guys have a folder for your components and your modules and pages. But what's new is the utilities.js file, which was briefly mentioned in Vincent's lecture. And if we just take a look at the utilities.js file, TLDR, it basically just black boxes making GET and POST requests. So this is the base URL is the URL to which we are making our GET and POST requests for this workshop. And the two key like method or functions that we'll be using here is just the GET request, which basically makes a GET request to a specific endpoint, and you can specify your parameters, and it will return the data that you want to get from the endpoint. And similarly, we also have a POST request implemented for you guys where you can request information from this endpoint, and you specify, or sorry, not request, but like send information to this endpoint and specify any parameters so that you send it to the server and tell the server, hey, I have all these data, can you help make changes for me? So these are just the two functions to highlight, but you can definitely also like implement it by yourself. We just implemented this for everyone's convenience. Okay, so if we recall our component hierarchy from workshop 2, we had this big overarching like app component that's just like the parent of everyone. We also had our nav bar. We also had our profile component, and inside the profile component, you guys have this like cat happiness where you can click to increase the cat happiness. And so after today's workshop, we'll be increasing it by expanding our tree by a lot. We'll be adding this whole entire feed subtree. And so what this feed subtree or feed component is, it's that it contains all of our stories and all of the comments for all of the stories. Oh, yeah. And within the feed, we have cards. And so a card is just like a component that contains a single post or story and all of its comments. So this single story is just like the contents of a story. And then the comments box is a component that basically represents all of the comments for a single post. And then within the comments block, we have the contents of a single comment. And then, oh, maybe that is not. Oh, this. Okay. Yes. And then we also have this new comments component. And basically what the new comments component is that it's just like an input where people can just input their comments and then send a post request to the server to add their comments to the post. And similarly, the new story component is another input box where people can make a post request to the server and add their stories to the feed. Okay, so our goals for today are to make the feed page. And so for the feed, when we think of a feed, you want to do two things. So the first thing you want to do is to be able to see other posts or all the posts. And you can get the other posts by making a GET request to the endpoint to get all of the posts. The second thing we want to be able to do is to make your own post. So you want people to be able to write their post and then send the text that they post to the server so that the server can add it in the back end. And to do that, we would make a post request to the endpoint. And we'll also be working on some front end routing. So we'll have multiple pages today. All right, so let's go. Let's start up our hot loader. And in the browser, head to localhost 5000. And I will also do that. And then I'll give you guys several minutes to start it up. Okay. Okay, so if we open up localhost 5000, you can notice that it's basically the same as where we ended in the last workshop. We just have our static profile page with our cat happiness. And so as a warm-up, let's go to app.js and we're going to import feed.js. And instead of rendering profile, we want to render feed. So what that means is that instead of seeing profile, like as the first thing I see in Capbook, I want to see the feed instead. And so let's do that together. So let's go to feed.js. I'll make this bigger. This is good enough. Okay.
Is the text big enough? Thumbs up.
Thumbs up.
Thumbs down.
Up. Okay, good.
For people in the back.
Oh, okay. One more. There we go. Okay. All right, so let's go to app.js. And so the first thing we want to do is to import feed at the top. So import feed from, and feed is in pages.
But yeah, try to say something.
Hello, testing, testing. Can people hear me?
I don't think so. You might want to just switch back to.
Hello,
Oh, yeah.
testing.
Yep, I'm good.
Oh, okay, cool. Okay, so now that we've defined our story state, the next thing we want to do is to fill our story state by first implementing a get call to the endpoint to get all of our stories. And then once we get all of our stories, we want to set our story state to whatever we got from the API endpoint. So also notice here, this is the get request or get helper function that we had from utilities function, the utilities.js, and that's what we're going to use. So we're going to make a get request, and the endpoint is this endpoint. So this is our endpoint. Yes. And so we're going to get all of our stories from the /API/stories endpoint. And we don't have any parameters for this API, so we don't really need to specify anything. And if you look back into the utilities.js file, by default, the get request has no parameters, so we do not need to add parameters. And one thing about get requests is that these get requests and also post requests, they take a lot of, or quite a bit of time. And the thing is, we don't want to update our stories before the get request finishes. So we want to wait until our get request finishes until we update our stories. Because sometimes React will be try to like optimize and it will say, hey, my get request takes so much time and I have this update step that's quick. So I'll do it first before I get all the stuff. And that's not what we want. What we want is to wait for our get request to finish and then update our state. So how we do that is what we call promises. So we add a dot then. In this block, basically it's saying whatever's in this block, execute it after I get all of my stories. So, and this dot then, basically it takes a callback function. So essentially it takes a function that whose input is whatever we get from the get request. And in this case, we get a list of JavaScript objects or a list of story objects, essentially. So our input would just be story objects. And then we want to set our state using set stories as story objects. Yes. So yeah, so we're just making a get request to the API/stories endpoint to say, hey, give me all of my stories for this feed, and then wait for me to get all of my data back until I set my stories. And so this block will only execute after this get request finishes. And so that's basically a TLDR of what this dot then does. We'll go into more further details in a future lecture as to what it actually does, but this is all you guys really need to know for now. Okay. And so once we get all of our stories and we store it in our story objects, or sorry, story state, we want to render it because right now, if we check, it's still not rendering anything, right? And that's because we haven't used the stories state yet. So what we want to do is instead of rendering this as feed, we just want to render the stories state. And essentially the curly braces in the divs just means that just tells React that, hey, I want to render whatever JavaScript expression is in this. Oh, and also another note is, as Vincent mentioned, React can't render JavaScript objects. So what we actually have to do instead is to encapsulate the story state in the JSON.stringify. So we want to turn it into a string so that React can render it. So what we actually want to render is JSON.stringify, and then within the stringify, the stories. So it's just like a string version of the stories. And so, yeah, so the curly braces is just saying like, telling React to render whatever JavaScript expression is in the curly braces. And so it can allow you guys to like render a lot more things than like just regular text. Okay, cool. And so if we look back at our feed, you can see like the output of our GET request. So it's like a list of two story objects. So these are just like the raw data that we get from our GET request. And I'll give you guys some moments to catch up. And while you guys are catching up, I'll kind of reiterate what I just did in this step because it's a little complicated. But as always, if you guys need help, feel free to put yourself on the queue or drop any general questions down in the questions doc. But essentially what we did in this step was we basically got all of our stories from the API endpoint and we stored it in our state. And then we rendered our stories. So the main thing to kind of just take away from this is just the get block, which basically gets all of our stories from this place, this API endpoint, and then waits after the API call finishes to update the state. So that's what this step does. Okay. Okay. All right. Yes. So if we test it, we should get something like that. All right. And so to catch up, we can do get reset -- hard, and then get checkout workshop 3, step 2. Okay. Okay. Actually, raise your hand if you need more time for this step. Thumbs up, thumbs down. Good to go. Good to go. Okay. Cool. Cool, cool. All right. So for step 3, if we go back to like our feed page, notice how like what we're rendering right now is just raw text. It's like just the raw text that we got from the API endpoint. And this kind of looks pretty ugly if you ask me. And I think like we can definitely make this a lot more aesthetic if we made each of these objects that are story objects that are returned to us a JavaScript or a React component. And so this step is basically just stylizing our component. And so this component that we'll be putting all of these stories in is the single stories component. And this step is just like stylizing it. But first and foremost, if we go back to our feed.js, we want to make a dummy single stories component and render it in our feed, just so that we kind of know what we're like looking at, right? And so the first thing we need to do is to import single stories. So import single stories from the modules /modules/ single stories. And I guess another note is that like this .. just means like go a folder above me and then go down into modules. So right now we're in feed.js and feed.js is in the pages directory, but the single stories is in modules. So what we want to do is we want to go up another level from pages to components, which is what the .. does, and then back down to modules and then back down to single stories. So yes, that's what the .. means. And then after we import the single story, we want to render it. So I'll get rid of this and instead render single story component. But if we go back into single stories, notice how it has 3 props. So it has an idea of the story, which we don't really need to worry about for this part of the workshop, but we'll cover it in the future workshops, or we'll use it in the future part. And then we do need our creator name and the content of the story. So for now, we can just pass in a dummy value for the creator name and the content of our dummy single story. So I'll do creator name. I'll put in a dummy value. Right? Equals to hot pot. And yes. So now that we have a single story component, if we go into our profile page, it will not render any of the things I just typed in. So it didn't render Helen, nor did it render I love hot pot, but this is expected because if we go back into single stories, it's just rendering the string, this is a single story. So now it's your guys' turn to basically style up the single stories cards. So we have provided several CSS classes for you guys to use. So it includes card dash story, the bold utility class, and the card dash story content. And so if we use these classes, we can hopefully make our stories component, single story component prettier, and also include all the information that we need. So in the end, we want it to look something like this. And so, and these CSS classes are in the card.css file. So if we go back to single stories, the first thing we want to do is to import the CSS file that has all of those classes that we need. So we do import card.css at the top. Okay. And so since like we don't really want to just say this is a single story, we want it to okay. Hello.
Wait.
Okay.
Yeah, it should be good.
Hopefully it'll be okay.
Yeah, that should be.
Okay, cool. Yes. So basically what this is doing is it's just taking the creator name that we've passed into our single story from its parent. So in this case, the parent is feed, and it's just rendering that. So if everyone can do the same thing for the content of the story. So we're just going to access it by saying props.content. And again, it's just taking whatever it's passed to it by the parent. So in this case, it will render I love hot pot. Okay. So if we go, uh-oh. I can't resolve card.css. Oh, whoops. Slash. Dot slash. Oh, yes. And to use our props, we actually do need to pass it in to our single stories. So do remember to pass in your props. Yay. Okay. So now that we have our creator name and our content, we want to stylize it so it looks prettier. So maybe if everyone can take, let's say 8 minutes or so to, or 5 minutes to kind of stylize and play around with the CSS classes and kind of make the post single stories look kind of like this using the card dash stories and bold utility and card dash story content classes. Huh? Help the help. Okay. Oh, also, if you guys need help, definitely put yourself onto the help queue. The staff is always here to help. And also, if you have any general questions, feel free to put them down on the questions doc. And on another note, if you have setup issues and you have like a Mac, there's a Piazza post that we made regarding how to set it up if like NPM hot loader is not working. But TLDR, Mac has this like special thing running on localhost 5000 and you just need to turn it off. Do you think you can finish the next one? Should I like leave time? So there's 20 minutes left. I think we have like 1.5 hours. Wait, let me check. Schedule. 1.5 hours. I think I can finish like. How long do you think yours will take? Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Okay. I was just asking if you wanted like the extra like 10 minutes because I thought I could finish by like 2:50 and we can have like part 5, but I don't know if I can finish. I would be able to like give you like 10 minutes today. Okay. Okay. All right, so to kind of go back to styling this, for our creator name, we just want it to be bold. So we just use the bold utility class. So our class name is u-bold. And for our content, we'll just use the card-story content, I believe. Card-story content. And if we go into Capbook, wow, voila. So we have our creator name and our post nicely formatted, much better than the raw data that we had when we first got our data from the GET request. Okay. Okay, so now that we have, okay, so yes, first let's catch up. So if we do get reset hard, reset dash dash hard, and then get checkout workshop 3, step 3. Okay. All right, so now that we have a kind of just like a dummy single story component, we now want to apply our single story or make all of our story objects that we got from the GET request into single story components. So essentially, for all of the elements in the stories array in feed, we want to turn them into a single story component. So instead of rendering this, we want to render an array of single story components. And if you remember from Vincent's lecture, so yes, we basically want an object array to a component array. And so if you remember from Vincent's lecture, we have this function in JavaScript called the map function. And what it does is it takes this input array and it creates a new array by applying a function to each and every element of the input array. So we have, so say our input array is just this array of JavaScript objects like so. And if our function that we provide just turns each, puts each of the name in the object in a div, then it will apply, the map function will apply the function on each of the elements individually to create a new element for each of the objects. So in the end, we'll end up with an array of divs, each of which has the name of the original object. So essentially, we're basically mapping each of these objects or each element in this object array to an component or element in the component array. And we do this because React can't render the object array, but it can render the component array. But another thing is just that this is also a lot more readable and aesthetically pleasing as well. We don't really want to render our raw data. Okay, so if everyone can follow along, we're going to go back into feed.js and we want to end up with something like this. So we're going to turn our story state, which is an object or an array of JavaScript objects, into an array of single story components. So I will define it here. So let's have a stories array, and let's just do feed stories, and we'll initialize it to null. So there's a reason for setting it to null. So one thing to consider is, what if we don't have any stories? Then we don't really want to render an array. We kind of want to just say we have no stories. So there's just two cases, which is why we initialize this to null. So the first case is if we have stories. And so that's if the stories array .length is not 0. So if it's not 0, then we do have stories and we do something in there. But if we don't have any stories, then we can just set feed stories to a div that just says no stories. All right. So if we do have stories, and also make sure to use 2 equal signs and not 1, we want to set feed stories to an array of components, single story components. And so we're going to set it to the output of the map function equals to, and we're applying this map function on the stories array. All right, so map function. And recall that this map function takes in as an input a function, and that function is the function that you want to apply to every element in the stories array. So this is a function, and since we're applying it to every element in the story array, the input is just a single story object, right? Because the input is just one element of the stories array. And what we want is we want to output a single story component. And with each component, we want it to have the creator name from the story object, the same creator name, rec.creator name. And we also want it to have the same content as the story object. Content equals to story object dot content. Right, because the single story basically just represents like the story object itself. So each single story is just a React component for each story object. Okay. All right. And so the last thing to do for this step is, instead of rendering this dummy single story, we can now render our stories, the list of single stories or feed stories. Okay. Hello, testing. Okay. Okay. Yes. So, what's this? No. No, thank you. No. Wait. Hello. Okay, there we go. All right. So if we look here, each of these posts came from our API endpoint. So it's the data that we got from our API endpoint. And essentially, we just took those raw data and we mapped it into each one of them into a single story component using the map function. So essentially, each single story component just reflects the contents of a single story object in the stories state. Okay. All right. And as always, if you have any questions, put yourself on the queue or drop any general questions in the questions doc. And let's all get on the same page by doing git reset hard and check out workshop 3 step 4. So do git. Okay, git checkout. Oh, sorry. Git reset -- hard and git checkout workshop 3 - step 4. All right, and this is going to be the last step of today. And then we'll continue on tomorrow. Okay. So now that was the GET request portion of this part of the workshop. So how about post, right? So we know how to get our stories. Now we want to post a new story onto the feed. So we want to, once we write down our stories, we want to send that content to the server and say, hey, can you add it to the database so that I can see all of my stories or the posts the next time I get it? And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to post to the /API/story endpoint to add a new story onto our feed. And this time, notice there's a parameter. The parameter is now content, which is basically the content that you want to post to the server, to the API. Okay, so now let's go into the new post input.js file. And this component is basically, and in this file, we're going to make a component that can post stories. So if we go into new post input.js, notice that we have a new stories component. And this is going to be the component that we're going to use to make post requests and make a new story. But first, we have to kind of notice like what's going on in this entire file, right? So we have at the top of this file, we have this component called the new post input file. And what this new post input file basically is, it's just like a text box with a submit button. So the text box is where people can type in whatever they want into the field, and it will update its value in the text box. And then the button, once you click on it, it will send it will do something. And that something is defined by the onSubmit function, which is a prop passed down into the new post input. So essentially, what we can do is we should define a function that can add stories to our feed and in our new story component, and then just render a new post input component with the function that we defined. So first, we're going to implement a function called add story. So const add story. And this function takes in a value. As we see up here, the onSubmit takes in a value. And this value is just going to be like, you can think of it as like the value inside the text box of the input, basically. And once we have this value, what we want to do is we want to send it up and post it to the API endpoint. And to tell the server, hey, can you add my content onto your feed? And so we're going to post to API stories. And this time, remember, we have an input, and this input will be called the content, and we set it to the value that was inputted. And so this is going to be our add stories function. And essentially, the next step we need to do is to implement render. So we can just render our new post input component in our new stories component. So we can just return a new post input component. But remember, we want to give it the prop pass down our add story function. And then also there's another prop that we can also specify called the default text. And it's like just the placeholder text that will like appear in the text box for the new post input. So like before people type in anything, it will like display whatever the default text is. So in my case, I will put default text equals to enter post here. Okay, so I know that was quite a bit. This is slightly more complicated than the get portion. So just to kind of reiterate what's going on, we have our new post input component. And this new post input component is a text box where people can type in things plus a button. But we don't know like what this button does yet. But like basically on click, when you click this button, it will call the handle submit function. And the handle submit function is right here. And what this handle submit function does is once you click on the button, it will basically just call the onSubmit function that's passed down to new post input. So it will just call the onSubmit prop of new post input. And so that's basically what we did down here in new story. So we passed down our add story function into new post input. And so once we do that, when we click on the button in new post input, every time we click on the button, it's going to make a post request with whatever's in the text box to the API/stories endpoint. And yes, if you have any questions for this part or any part, feel free to drop any questions in the question stock or hop on the queue. Yes. Okay. So we're running a little bit low on time. So the last step is to render this new story component, right? So we have this whole way to input stories. Now what we want to do is to just render it. So first we need to import new stories at the top, new story from modules/new post input.js. And the reason that I put this new story in bracket curly braces and not like single stories is because if we go into single stories, it's just exporting single story by default. So we don't need the curly braces. But in the case of new story, in new post input, we're exporting two things. And so we want to tell React which thing we want from this new post input, which is why we need to use the curly braces for this and not for single stories. Okay, so now that we imported it, we can add new story to the top. Okay, yeah, yay! I see a lot of you have. Okay, nice. So what we can do is we can just make a post. Just say I love East, and I'll post it. And if I refresh, I should see it at the bottom. Oh. No. But yes, but I see many of you have gotten it working. So just to reiterate what's going on in this post request, now that we have an actual text box. So this whole text box plus button thing is technically rendered. It's all rendered in the new post input component. So all of that is defined. The text box and the submit button is defined in the new post input component, right? And so if we just render the new post input component, or yes, we don't really have, it won't do anything when this button is clicked, right? So when we click this button, the submit button, it will trigger a function. And the function that it triggers is the prop that we pass down to it, the onSubmit prop function that we pass down to it. And we define that function in the new story component. So essentially, we can think of the new story component as a parent of the new post input component. And it's passing down the add story function down to the new post input as a prop. And so whenever we click the submit button, it will call the add story function every time, which is why we make a post request. If we didn't give it the add story function, it will not make a post request every time we click it. So we must specify. And so you guys will do something similar to this in the next part of this workshops on comments. And yes, hopefully this is helpful. Oh, yes. Let's see. Yes. Yes. Huh?
You have to close it.
Close it?
Refresh. Close. Yeah, refresh.
Oh, you added 2 slides. Okay. Okay. Okay, so that's it for this part of the workshop today. We'll continue it tomorrow. We have some homework available for you guys. Is it mandatory or not mandatory? It's optional homework. It's okay. So the React practice homework 3 is optional, but what's not optional is the milestone 0. So make sure to turn in your milestone 0 by 11:59 tonight. Yes, but yes, thank you. Yes, only one teammate needs to turn in your milestone 0. Not all of you, like, don't turn it in. Like, don't have everyone turn it in. Only one person per team.
Okay, hi everyone. We're gonna get started soon. So we're continuing the workshop that we left off from yesterday in the afternoon. We're gonna start on step 5 soon. So if you haven't done this already, to catch up on the stuff from yesterday, just cd to the directories, the Capbook React directory, get reset dash hard and get checkout workshop 3 step 5. So again, this is the same repo that I've been working on this whole time. You don't have to clone it again. Okay, so first of all, the first thing that we're going to work on today is routing between pages. So let me show. So recall that this is our basic component tree. We have the app on the top, and the app is the parent of other pages like the feed, the profile. And today we're going to add like a not found page. And it's also the parent of the nav bar, which isn't a page, but like it's still a child of the app. So how we want this to work is that we want the website to display different content based on different routes. So for example, if you do capbook.com, you want it to point to the feed. If you have capbook.com/profile, you want it to point to the profile. And you have capbook.com/some URL that's like not defined, then you want it to point to the not found page. So how we're going to do this is like, this sounds like really complicated, right? But we don't actually have to build like this whole logic ourselves. We're going to use a library that helps us achieve this. So the library we're going to use is the reach router library. Note that this is different from the React router library. They sound very similar. They're only one letter apart, but they're two completely different libraries. They both route, but they're completely different. So when you're looking for documentation, make sure you're looking for the reach router library and not the React router library. But yeah, this is the library we'll be using for our routing purposes. So how this works on a basic level is we enter a URL in our address bar, for example, and the URL will then tell the router that, oh, I want to go to this page. And then the router will then tell the program, oh, render either component A or component B or component C, depending on what you define for each page. So this is what we're going to do for step 5. So in app.js, first the broad level overview, we're going to use the router component to be able to route between different pages, like I mentioned. And then in navbar, we want to have the links on the navbar so that the user can click on them to route between different pages. And this is going to use the link component, which is part of the router library, reach router library. So we want something like this, like the feed will show like the feed, obviously, and then the profile, if you click on profile, it'll show a profile. And if you put in any other URL, it'll default to the not found. So let's move to our code. If people walked in late, just remember to cd capbook, React repository, get reset dash hard, get checkout workshop 3 step 5. Okay, so first, we want to be in app.js. This is where we left off from yesterday. We didn't really have much in here yet. So the first thing we want to use the reach router library. So the first thing we want to do is import it, right? Like we can't use it if we didn't import it. So don't worry too much about the syntax for this, but this is just how you would import for the reach router library for this particular import. So you want the router to be enclosed in curly braces. And then it's just a package. And if you don't have this, you should npm install to have it. So first import it, and we also want to import the not found page. It's already defined. How do I make, okay. Yeah, so we have the not found page that we already defined for you. So we want to import that the same way we import profile and feed up here. So import not found from /pages not found.js. Good. Okay, so now that we have our imports, everything we need right now, let's go down, and right now we're just rendering the feed. So we also want other pages, right? Like we can uncomment this. We have the profile, and let's also have the not found page. So again, this is how you create a component if you forgot. You just have the opening angle brace and the closing slash and angle brace. So if we just have this, oh, but if you haven't already, where's my terminal? If you haven't already, npm run hotloader so that you can see it. But yeah, so if I, is audio okay? Oh, I touched it. Okay, it's fine. So if you uncommented the profile and added the not found page like this, we have our pages now, but like they all show up like together, which is like not really, okay, I'm not gonna scroll down, but they all show up together on the same page, and this is not what we want. Like we want them on separate pages, and like different URLs like will route to the different pages. So let's go back to our app.js and actually use the router library to achieve this. So how you're actually going to use this, it's actually pretty simple. Like they take care of all of the logic for you. So you have an opening router tag, and then outside, you just enclose these 3 pages. You have a closing one. So this is the first thing you want to do. And the second thing you want to do is tell router like which URLs each component is associated with. So for the feed, for the profile, let's do a profile first. So the prop name that takes in is path. This is a prop name that the library defines. We didn't define it ourselves. And the path, let's just have it like the default. So if we have capbook.com, like if you don't put anything afterwards, it will default. Oh, sorry, this is profile. Okay, let's have profile after. And then for the feed, let's just have the homepage default to feed. So this would be capbook.com/profile. This would be capbook.com/ or just no slash. And then not found, basically anything that doesn't fall under these 2 categories. And so we have this very useful keyword defined by the library called default. And we can just put that in. So let's save this app.js, and let's go back to our capbook. So now we have our homepage as the feed. The profile doesn't appear anymore. That's nice. So let's try in the URL bar, add profile afterwards. Yay, raster profile. Does everyone get this? Good? Okay. And if we type something random, it'll default to the not found page. So I got a router working. That's all nice and well. But the thing is that like, it's really, really burdensome if the user has to type in the URL every time they want to go to a different page, right? So we want to actually have the links here in the nav bar, so we can just click on them and it'll route to different URLs. So let's go back to our code, and now let's look for navbar.js, which should be under modules. So navbar, right now we just have a navbar title. We also want the links to the pages. So first of all, we want to import the link component. This is just also provided by the library, very convenient. And you import it from this @reach/router. Okay, so now after we imported link, we actually want to like put the links in the navbar. So let's have opening link. And then here, we also want the link component, like we define the URLs in the router, like part in app.js, right? Like we define the URLs here. We also have to tell the link, like which URL each link points to. But instead of using path, they just defined it as 2. I don't know why they did this, but it's just different. But this is the same thing as the URLs that we define. So they have to match. So this should be our home page. We can call it feed, we can call it home. And then we also want to have our profile page as a link in the nav bar. We don't have to have not found because it's not like a real page. So let's save this. And let's go back to our site. So now I have these links over here. They should work. They do work. Very nice. Okay, now the problem is that they work, but they're really ugly. They're like not in line with the title and everything. So let's just try to style it a little bit. So let's go to our very conveniently provided navbar.css file. And realize that, oh, we defined this very useful class called navbar link container. So let's use this and contain both of the links in there. So just enclose these 2 links in a div. And let's also use this other CSS class. I don't remember if we used this yesterday, but there's another CSS class that we defined that's pretty useful called, where is it? Inline block. So it just puts things in line with each other because we want the title to be in line with the other links. So this is in utilities.css, by the way. But all CSS files, even when you name them in different files, like they're all like packaged together in the end. So you can use stuff from any CSS file in like any other JS file, just to be clear. So let's put this in front of for the link container and also for the title. So save that. And let's go back to our app. So now they're in line, but this is still not like, they're like right next to each other. This is not great. So let's add a little bit more styling. Let's go back to navbar.css. And we have a thing called navbar link. This also sounds very useful. So copy that. Let's go back to navbar.js and let's style the links themselves. So before or after the 2, it doesn't really matter. Add another class name and let's add the navbar link CSS class to each of the links. Good. Okay, great. Oh, yeah. Oh, this is workshop 3. Workshop 3, step 5. So this is the same workshop from yesterday. Yeah, sorry. Okay, so let's save this and let's go back. This is very nicely styled now. They should be like not like purple underline like before, and they should have space in between and in line with the title. Okay, so that's it for step 5. Hopefully everyone followed along for that. If you didn't, feel free to like review it later, but for now, let's just do large enough. Get reset -- hard, git checkout workshop 3, step 6. So now we should be on step 6. Hopefully everyone has done that. Oh, by the way, I don't know if this was explicitly mentioned, maybe it was, but for npm run hotloader, you should run it in a different tab because like the process always has to be like running for your local host to show up. So if you have it in the same tab, you can't like type git commands, so you have to open a different tab. Yeah, so, oops, let's go back to the presentation. Yeah, so if you haven't followed along, just get reset hard, check out step 6. Okay. So steps 6 to 8 are basically working on comments. So if you remember from the workshop yesterday, we were working on getting stories to show up in feed and allowing us to post different stories on Capbook. So now that we have stories basically done, we want to have comments on the stories as well. So people have comments associated with each story and also allow users to be able to post comments. So in this sense, steps 6 to 8 are pretty analogous to steps 1 through 4, but we'll be working on comments instead of stories. So instead of working in feed.js, which is like the biggest container that contains our stories, we'll be working on a slightly smaller level on card.js. So like each card.js will like contain all the comments. So a reminder of a high-level overview. We use, for yesterday's half of the workshop, we used a GET request to get the stories from the backend from an API that we already defined for you. And we have, today we're going to use a single comment component to render data. And yeah, so previously GET, we used /API/stories to return all stories. And we didn't need any parameters for this GET request because like we just tell a database, we want all the stories. We don't care which ones, just all of them. And then when you post this new story, we wanted to insert a parameter called content because we need the database to know like what is actually stored in this post, right? So that's the parameter that we used. So now we're going to use some new API endpoints. We're going to use a GET request /API/comment to return all comments for a particular story. So in this case, we actually need a parameter because we need to tell the database like which story we're getting the comments from. Like we don't want just all the comments like batched together randomly. We want the comments for a specific story. And same for posting. So besides the content of the comments, we also want the parent, so like the parent story of the comment to be stored so that we can retrieve it later. Okay, so yeah, the parameters are different. So let's follow along for step 6. High-level overview, we're going to first get comments in card.js. So this will be similar to getting stories in feed.js. And then we're going to render them similar to how you rendered stories. And then we're going to use card in feed, the card component in feed.js. So in the end, we want to display something like this. Obviously, this is a bit ugly right now, but we want to just first get the comments to show up. So this is our like pretty nicely formatted post from yesterday, the story, and then below it, like an associated comment. Oops, that's step 7. Okay, so let's go back to our code. Wait. Okay, get comments in card.js. So let's go to card.js. And so what card is, if you remember our component tree, let me see if I can go back to our component tree. Okay, so this is our component tree. So card.js is what's going to end up holding a single story and a block of comments. So that's what card is. It's just a container for both of these things. And its parent is feed. Okay, where is the slide? Okay, so yeah, so we're going to go to card.js and we want it to be the parent of single story. So we're going to import single story, import single story from, where is it? Okay, it's in the same directory, so we can just do. We also want to import, oh, not importing single comma yet. Okay, so let's just import single story for now. And then we want to define the state to hold comments. So remember in feed.js, we defined like state to hold stories. And then we got a GET request to store the data into this state variable. So we're going to do basically the same exact thing in card.js. So we're going to define state to hold comments, close bracket, equals use state, and let's use a list as well. And remember, if we're using use state, we also need to import it from React. If you don't import it, then it'll throw an error. Yeah, so now we have the comments state, and now we're going to implement a get call to retrieve the comments and then assign it to the states. So how we do this, let's refer to feed again. So a lot of code right now, you can just like copy and paste, right? Like we already did this. So I don't want to retype it. I'm just going to copy this. This is in feed.js. So I'm going to paste this, except we need to change this. So let's do comment. I mean, this is singular. I don't know why we named it like this, but it's singular comment, not comments. And then comment objects. This would be set comments. Ah, that was very bad. Okay. And then this should also be comment objects. But remember, the difference between this API request and the previous one is that we need to specify which story it's associated with. So how we're going to do this is we're going to have an extra parameter. It's in a curly brace, and then you do parent. So parent is the name of the parameter. And then this is just, so if you look here, the props that we're going to pass into this component, we already told you what props we're going to use. We're going to pass in the ID of the story that's associated with this card. We're going to pass in the creator name of the story, and we're going to pass in the content of the story. So this is the one we want because we want to know like the ID of the story that's associated with the comment. So we're going to do props dot what? Please. Okay. Props dot underscore ID. Okay, I think it was doing that because I didn't put as an input, so it doesn't know what props are yet. Yeah, so remember to put props. If you're using props, put it inside the parentheses of the function. So this should be fine. We should set comments as comment objects. And now we need to implement the render. So return parentheses. And we want to render, first let's have an opening and closing div. By the way, if you have multiple components that you're rendering within the return statement, you should enclose them both in like a parent div, else React will complain. So first it says render a single story using props. Single story. So what are the props? Let's go revisit. Single story.js. So the props that you want are the ID, creator name, and content. It's very useful because these are the same exact props that we have here. So we can just pass in ID equals props dot underscore ID, creator name equals props dot creator name, and what's the last one? Content. Content equals props dot content. So the thing in the curly brace is like the prop that we're passing the card. And then this thing is the prop to single story. So although they have the same names here, they're like props for different components, just to be clear. So we have ID, creator name, content. Good? Thumbs up, thumbs down. Okay, hopefully it's good. So first we have single story, and then we want to render the comments from the state using json.stringify. Okay, so I think we did this yesterday. Remember to put it in curly brackets because this is a JavaScript function. So json.stringify, and then just render the comments. Did that. Now let's go back to our okay. I should have cleared this database. Then. Why did people do this to me? I'm so sad. Okay. Okay, but I think it still should, let's see if there's any errors. The comments are supposed. Okay, there's no errors. Oh, wait. So we have our card, but the comments are, so me and Helen put comments on these two posts or one of these posts on the top. So they should show up. They're not showing up right now. And the reason being that we haven't used card anywhere yet. So we implemented all of these things in card.js, but this component card is not used in feed yet. So we want to replace whatever we have in feed right now with card. So let's go to feed. Oh, thanks. So let's go to feed and we have like these like single story. So now instead of using single story, we want to import card instead because card now includes our single story. So we don't need single story anymore in feed. So let's delete this. No, actually, let's just change it. Import card from card. Okay. So now they imported it. Instead of rendering single stories here, we can just change this to card. And these prompts stay the same, but we also have to define the ID. Remember, because we need to know what the ID of the story is. So just do story object, which again represents each story inside the stories state. And the story state, we add the data by retrieving it from the backend here. So this is where we define a state. This is where we fill it. And then this is where we render it. So save this file. Let's go back to, very awkward. Okay, awkward, give me a second. This is awkward. Does anyone else have this problem? Is it just me? Are other people able to run it? Yes, no, yes. Okay, it's just me. That's awkward. Can't resolve YouTube. Live debugging 101. That is quite awkward. Do TAs have insights? Hmm?
Yeah, you shouldn't have a pre-signed post before. That's just.
Oh my God. VS Code wants to kill me. Okay.
If you ever run into this issue in your project, it's because VS Code hates you. So just delete the import.
Yeah, sometimes if you type things, VS Code like randomly completes it with something else that you don't need, which is very sad. Okay, so now that is solved. Thank God. Okay, so now we have comments. Why do, okay, that's fine. But now we have comments showing up. Very nice. So now the next thing was on the slide. That was so sad. Okay, so we'll get comments, render them like stories. We use card and feed.js. Okay, so we finished step 6. Hopefully people follow along and didn't have the random import bug. If you did, please delete it. Okay, so now we're going to move on to step 7. Step 7 is your turn. So we're going to import, well, you're going to implement single comment.js. And then you're going to use single comment in card.js, just like how we use card and feed.js. So card is the parent of single comment and feed is the parent of card. And how you're going to implement single comment, you can refer to a single story, which we already have it implemented. Also, if you didn't catch up on the last one, just do get reset dash hard, get checkout W3 step 7. And yeah, so this is going to be similar to single story, and you basically want it to format like the bottom here. So you want the name to be bolded and then have a horizontal line, vertical line, and then have the content not bolded. So give it a shot on your own. If you have issues, want personal help, put yourself on the queue. Oh, we didn't write it, but weblab.2/queue. If you have questions, weblab.2/questions, and let's give it a go. Oh, also in the meantime, some quick announcements. If you didn't see the post on Piazza, unfortunately, MIT flipped their policies on us, so we won't be able to serve lunch for the time being. We're trying to work this out with MIT, but for now, we're just going to extend the lunch break to 45 minutes instead of 30 minutes, and hopefully people can have time to get something quick from the stud or nearby places. And the second thing is milestone 0 was due last night. And we're going to open milestone 1 sign up soon for presentations over the weekend. So we're going to post, like, I think today. So if you're stuck on styling, remember that we have some predefined CSS classes already in utilities.js, utilities.css. So feel free to make use of those. There's also a lot of predefined classes in card.css that may be useful, such as card-comment body. Also, you guys are free to like discuss among yourselves. It doesn't have to be like dead quiet in here. Okay, how are people doing? Yes? No? Need more time? If you need more time, please raise your hand. Okay, I'll give you guys like a few more minutes. Why'd you do that? This is mine. How are people doing? Raise your hand if you're done. Raise your hand if you need 3 more minutes. Okay, let's do 3 more minutes and then we'll move on for the sake of time. It's okay if you don't get this. Yeah, we will go over the solutions in a bit. We're gonna move on for now. It's okay if you haven't finished. You can do get reset dash as hard, get checkout step 8, workshop 3 step 8. Also, there might be an issue with everybody trying to ping the API at once because they're using a free Heroku deployment, so it might lag a little bit. So if you feel like you did your code right and the API is not displaying anything, it might be just because it's overloaded for now. So don't worry too much about that. So let's move on to, oh wait, no, let's go over step 7. Okay, so first we wanted to implement single comment.js. And the hint is that we want it to be similar to single story.js. So if we look at single story.js, it's just divs, right? Like it's divs with some styling, and we use props to pass in the actual data because the component doesn't actually have any logic in it. It's just taking the data from the props that we pass in somewhere else. So basically, we're going to do a similar thing in single comment. So we already give this class here, I guess, card comment body. So let's try to have, so we want the creator name first. And we want the creator name and the content to be in the same line, remember? So one of the helpful HTML tags to use for this is span. So we can use span, and then we want to get the props for, this is so annoying. Please do not import again, okay. So remember we need to pass in props as a parameter for us to be able to use props. So it's props dot, what was it, creator name. But we want this to be bold, right? So let's look at some of the classes we provide in utilities. And wow, there's this very useful one called uBold. Maybe that makes text bold. We don't know, but we can try. So u-bold. Let's go back to single comment. And let's do class name equals uBold. And okay, and also we want the content. So, oh wait, no, we want the horizontal line, I mean vertical line. So let's just do a space for a vertical line space for our string. And then let's do props dot content. So remember we need to input all of these in curly braces because this is like JavaScript code within HTML. Like we're in a div, so this is HTML. So now we have this, but we can't really check if it works yet because we haven't really used single comment anywhere. So let's save this first. Okay, let me wait like a few seconds for people to catch up. Good to go? Thumbs up, thumbs down. Good, okay. So let's now use this single comment component in card.js. Remember, card is our parent of both stories and comments. So let's go to card.js. Want to import single comment. Single comment.js. And yeah, so now instead of this, like JSON.stringify, we want to use the component that we created with the styling and everything. So remember how I did this in feed for stories? Let's go back to feed.js under pages. We have this whole block, right? Like we check if stories list is null, we check the length, then we like map each story to like a component. So this is basically the exact same thing we want to do, except for comments. So let's just copy this block in feed.js. And then let's go back to, where were we? Card? Yeah, okay. So let's paste this here. Except instead of stories, now we have comments list. And then we already have this defined here, so we can just replace this with comments. Has comments. So if we have comments, then our comments list should just map each comment to a comment object. I mean, map each comment object to single comment. So the component that we just defined, we already imported it. Okay, nice. And then this, we should also replace this with comment object ID, comment object dot creator name, comment object dot content. Otherwise, we can do no comments. So now instead of JSON.stringify comments, we can just display the comments list, which contains a list of single comment components. Right. So let's replace this JSON.stringify comments with our list of nicely styled components, hopefully. And this has to be in curly braces again, because this is a JavaScript object. So array. So let's go back to our browser. Let's see if we did it correctly. Oh, did the API crash? The API may have been. Does it work for anyone else? I think the API might have been sad. Okay, yeah, the API requests are not complete. Okay, so assuming we did that correctly, it should show up as nicely styled comments. Just right now, the API, everybody's trying to access at the same time, which is good because that means everybody got it. But our Heroku is having a little bit, oh, we got it. Okay, great. Oh, it says no comments. Yeah. So, yes, that's a lot of requests. We should have comments for these. Let me see. Let's see our code. Get API.comment. I think this should be correct. Question mark. ID, creator name, content, comments list. No comments. Yeah, it might be because, oh yeah, I think there's.
Sorry, I just upgraded it to like down to 2 seconds and then they'll be more powerful.
Oh, okay. 2 seconds.
Yeah. Like it should be back on now.
Yeah, another helpful debugging thing is besides the console is also a network tab on like inspect element, and it will show like the network requests that you're making. So you can see like for this, we have no response data here because it's still processing. But once it finishes, you should have like response, failed to load response data. Okay, well, yeah, but under normal circumstances, it would say like 200 or something. Yeah, this is status code 503. But you can have a lot of useful information here. Okay, well, let's just assume we did it correctly for the sake of time. And let's move on to step 8. So like under normal circumstances, you should display it like this. Yeah. Okay. So step 8, it says your turn. I don't think we're going to do this. I'm just going to do follow along. I cannot edit this. Oh, well, I gave up. It's fine. So what we're going to do for step 8 is to implement new comment and new post input. So remember yesterday we implemented a new story, which allows users to post a story. So now we're going to implement a thing that allows users to post a new comment. And then now we're going to add this new comment thing to card.js afterwards. So remember our API request, we already used the get request to get comments. We're going to now use the post request to post comments. So just follow along for here. So let's go to new post input.js. Should be under modules. So we have this. We already went over this yesterday. It's just like a very basic template function that we already provided, new post input. And we use new post input in new story. So new story is going to be, new comment is going to be similar to new story. Refer to new story, haha. Okay, so let's copy this because I'm lazy and paste it here. Oh wait, no. Add comment. Okay, so now I have this block of code, but remember we need an extra parameter, the story ID that the comment is associated with. I believe it is called parent. Let me check. Yes, it is called parent. So parent, want the story ID. Very useful. We define here that we already want to pass in a prop to this new comment called story ID. So we're just going to do props. Oh, we need to pass in props as a parameter here. Remember, if you don't do this, React won't know like you want to use props. So do props dot story ID. So again, this is the story ID. This is the prop that we're passing in to new comment later on. We haven't done it yet, but we're passing in later on, so we can use it for now. And then this is the values, whatever is in the text box that you're entering. Instead of post API story, on a post API comment singular. And then this is the parameters that you're inputting. And now we want to render it. So let's refer to new story. So yeah, we're going to render a new post input. Instead of on submit add story, we're going to have on submit add comment that we defined here. So let's paste this again because I'm lazy. And default text, new comment on submit. It's not add a story, it's add comment. Okay, so again, this should be analogous to the new story, except everything that's story related now we're making it comment related. Okay, so now let's go back to car.js, and we want to have this new comment thing so people can actually post comments. So let's go to car.js in the same directory. And at the bottom, let's have, oh, we need to import it. So at the top, let's import new comment from /. Oh wait, no, we need to put in curly braces, remember, because it's one of multiple exports and you post input. So let's do this. Okay. So now we have new comment imported. So let's scroll down. And we want the new comment thing to be at the bottom of the comments, right? That makes sense because like that's how social media works. So let's have a new comment. And remember, okay, we're back. Okay, so I don't know if you guys got the prompt passed in, but I'm just going to type it out now. So we want to have our new comment component and pass in story ID, which is so we have the ID of the story passed in as a prop in car.js. So we can just use that prop. So equals props.id. So you already also used it here for a single story. It's the same. So now let's try Save that, go back to, let me give a moment for people to catch up. Good? 10 more seconds? No? Yes? Okay, I'm assuming people are good. So we have our new comment here. Let's go back to localhost 5000, which might still be sad. That is so awkward. Yeah. Yeah, so it says pending, which means that's running. But look at these very nice 200 statuses. These are the ones that you want in general. Also, when you build your own like website, you'll be using your own APIs, so you won't have like trouble with like overloading unless you have like 100 test users or something. But yeah. Okay, so give it a moment. 503. Wait. Nick, did it work for you? Okay. Okay, so our server is sad, but yeah. Great. Okay. So just to review really quick, we implemented new comments in new post input. This allows people to add comments, and we post it using the API endpoint that we defined. And then in card.js, we import new comments in curly braces, and then we want to add it in our render so that you can actually see it on the web page. And we pass in story ID as a prop. I mean, we pass in props._ID to the story ID prop. Yeah. Okay, so under, yeah, this is very sad, but hopefully at some point it will work later on if you try when not everyone is trying at the same time. Okay, so let's move on. So if you need to catch up, git reset --hard, git checkout workshop 3 step 9. Yeah. Seems like we did it correctly. Okay. So now let's look at what we're supposed to do for step 9. Yeah, we're on step 9 now. So for step 9, we want to extract out components. So remember during Vincent's lecture yesterday, we talked about how we want to keep components small and modular so that we don't like repeat a bunch of code. And so that stuff is easy to understand. Like that's the point of the whole component tree. Like we don't write all the code in like one giant file because it's going to be super hard to debug and super hard to make small changes. Whereas if you have components, you can like reuse them wherever. Like that's the power of React, right? So let's try to improve upon card.js. So as a review, like this is the component hierarchy that we presented yesterday. We have the app on the top, right? We have the feed, the profile that we're working on. And the feed is like basically what we've been working on. The feed splits into a card and like a news story thing on the top. And then the card is further split into single story. And we want to actually use this comments block thing now. So this is the thing we're going to make. And the comments block will be the container for individual comments as well as the new comment input that we just created that we cannot see right now, but you will just assume it is there. Okay, so comments block is what we're going to be working on. So at the end of step 9, we want it to look like this. So instead of just having like individual comments, like we want to have like them like in this like little box here. And it looks nice and yeah. So let's go back to our code. So like to clarify, like we're not really adding anything like new here, right? Like all the data and everything we already have. But so this is just like refactoring our code. And this is like important. Like you may think like, oh, why do we need to refactor? Like I just want to like make my website. But like when you're making a website, you come up with bugs or like you realize that your files are too big and like you have no idea what's going on. Like refactoring is an important step to like make sure your code is modular. Okay, so let's go to our code. And we want to go to comments block. So comments block.js is what's going to contain our comment stuff. So let's import single comment, which is our individual comments here. And let's also import new comment. Wait, no, that is wrong. Curly brace, new comment is, remember, defined inside new post input. So after these two imports, we want to implement render. So this is essentially like what we already have, right? Except we're just moving everything to comments block. So let's move, wait, comments block. So the props that we're going to pass into comments block is our list of comments, which is very important. And also the story. It should be named story ID because we're not passing the story object, we're passing the ID to associate with the story. I don't believe you can pass entire objects as props, although I am not 100% sure, but it's good practice to pass in IDs instead of objects. Yeah, so let's do let's have a div, a parent div, oh, return. And let's use one of our CSS classes that we already provide. I'm just going to type it here. It's in card.css, I think. And it's called card-comment section. So this is just going to represent our comment section. And then we're going to, so we have these comments, right? Oh, we have to pass in props. So we want to map each of the comments. Remember the map function? To a single comment. So I already have single comment imported here. So single comment. Oh, we already did this. Yeah. So this is in card.js. We already did this mapping thing. Oh. Except, oh, okay. Yeah, I named the same thing. That's very helpful. Okay, so we map each comment object to a single comment component. And then we also have our, like, we're basically just moving this entire thing over. New comment. So this is our list of comments, and this is our new comment component. So what else do we have to do? Oh, we have to use, now we want to use comments block in card.js instead of all of this madness. So let's move to card.js. So again, this is just like moving the code that we defined somewhere else into like a component itself to make it more modular. So let's go back to card.js and let's import comments block. So we want to replace these things with our comments block component. So these below single story, we're not touching single story because that's our post itself. We can have comments block. So do people remember what props are passing into comments block? Raise your hands. Please. So what do we need to display our comments block? Yeah. Yeah, we need a parent item and what else? What else do we need for our comments block to actually display our comments? Yeah, so we need to pass in the comments themselves, right? The component itself is just like a render function with like we already assume here that we're passing in comments. And we assume here that we're passing in the story ID. So that is what we need to pass in the comments block. Okay, so what is it called? Read it and forgot. Okay, comments equals, we define it here, name it the same thing. And then we also want to pass in our story ID, which is passed in as a prop here as well. So it's just props._ID. We also use it here. So this is our comments block. So we can delete this because we don't use it anymore. So this makes our code much more compact. Is our API working yet? Possibly not. Man, this is sad. Okay, but did everybody follow along for that part, or do people have like any clarification questions? If you have like general questions you don't want to ask like in here, you can also find the questions doc. Yeah. Oh, so the new comment thing, we included in comments block. Yeah. So comments block is just going to encapsulate everything that has to do with comments. And then we're just going to use this entire component in here in our card. So then we don't need all of this like comments logic here because comments block takes care of all of that. So now our code is more compact, right? Like card, you can just look at it and there's not much logic. You can see, oh, we have a story here, I have a comments block. And then comments block is what contains all the logic, and single story is what contains all the stuff for stories. Does that make sense? Any other questions? Okay. Okay, that is still being sad. But yeah, in your own time, if you want to like go back and like look at it when not everyone's trying to use the API, then maybe it will work. But it is supposed to look like this. It's really pretty. Okay, so what time is it? It's 12:25. So step 10, I'm just going to leave it as homework because we don't have time for that. But to catch up, you can do git reset -- hard, git checkout workshop 3, step 10. And basically step 10 is going to be like right now, well, I guess you don't see the page right now because it's not loading. But if it did load, you would see that every time you make a new post or new comment, you need to refresh the page to be able to see it, which is like, so it technically works, but it's like really clunky, right? Like if you're using Facebook and every time you post a comment, you need to refresh to see it, like that's just bad. So you want to have it update automatically. And the way you want to do this is like, basically you want to make use of state, because every time like state changes, remember we talked about how like, if you want a component to re-render, like you change its state. So that I'll leave that as homework, and feel free to post on Piazza or come to off. We don't have office hours today. Okay, post. Remember to post on Piazza if you have questions with this. Obviously, this is optional, but if you want extra practice, like this may be useful for your app if you're building something that like needs auto refresh. So yeah, leave that as homework. And yeah, so you can. So this is the end of workshop 3. We recognize this is like a pretty long workshop and also a pretty challenging workshop. It's totally okay if you didn't like follow along on most of the steps. Just if you have certain clarification questions, always post. Like we want to help. We want you guys to understand. And if you want to see the solutions, you can just check out workshop 3 complete.